The aggressive strobe of digital neon billboards slices through the damp twilight of the evening rush hour, casting long, fractured ribbons of electric crimson and high-voltage blue across the wet, dark asphalt below. Outside the vibrating metal hull of our crowded commuter train, a persistent drizzle smears the city landscape into a trembling, out-of-focus labyrinth of concrete, steel and moving headlights. Inside this pressurized capsule of public transit, the air is thick, dry, and heavily saturated with the artificial warmth of the climate control vents, carrying a faint, synthetic hum that perfectly mirrors the internal restlessness of the bodies packed tightly together along the narrow aisle. We stand shoulder to shoulder, our faces illuminated by the pale, cold backlighting of our smartphones, our thumbs performing a rapid, near-compulsive dance across glass screens as we scroll through endless feeds of information, breaking news, and social updates. Every chirp of an incoming notification, every high-frequency pinging of a smart device, and every sudden burst of digital noise acts as a miniature whip-crack to our attention, demanding that we remain permanently wired, hyper-alert, and instantly responsive to an unseen network of global demands. We are a generation that has managed to eliminate the physical distance between data and the human brain, wrapping ourselves in a seamless cocoon of total connectivity. Yet as we look into our own reflections warped in the dark windows of the moving train, we cannot shake a creeping, heavy suspicion that our profound technological mastery has come at an uncalculated, catastrophic cost to our internal sovereignty. We feel an intense, unrelenting velocity driving our daily existence, a subtle yet omnipresent pressure that forces us to move, to achieve, and to consume at a speed that completely outpaces the organic rhythms of the biological earth beneath our feet. From the moment our eyes open to the artificial alarm of our device at dawn, we are flooded with an immediate, overwhelming torrent of tasks, emails, calendars, and expectations, launching our minds into a state of instant acceleration before our feet have even touched the floor. We look at our complex schedules, our color-coded task managers, and our long lists of professional and personal goals, and we tell ourselves that this frantic multitasking is the true definition of a productive, successful human life. We have weaponized the terminology of efficiency, turning our relationships, our sleep patterns, and even our moments of personal wellness into metrics to be tracked, measured, and continuously optimized. We have convinced ourselves that if we can just run a little faster, respond to messages a little quicker, and squeeze one more obligation into the margins of our day, we will finally earn the right to slow down, to breathe deeply, and to experience a state of genuine safety and peace. Yet, no matter how many milestones we cross, no matter how many projects we successfully execute, and no matter how many validations we receive from the world around us, the horizon of our contentment remains stubbornly, agonizingly out of reach, moving further away with every frantic step we take on this hyper-stimulated treadmill. This collective condition has birthed a profound, contemporary paradox. We are a society that is completely wired, yet utterly exhausted, possesses instant access to the collective wisdom of human history, yet is entirely devoid of deep internal authority. When the external noise of our environment drops away for a brief, unmonitored interval, when we are waiting for an elevator, sitting in traffic, or lying in the dark before sleep, we are suddenly confronted with an acute, terrifying sensation of existential vacancy. Within that unedited silence, the momentum of our frantic striving drops to zero for a split second, and in that gap, we catch a glimpse of a deep, structural weariness that cannot be cured by a vacation, a promotion, or a temporary digital detox. To escape the uncomfortable texture of this internal void, we immediately reach for our devices, immersing our minds in a fresh cascade of data and emotional intensity, successfully mistaking the short-circuiting of our sensory networks for real, sustainable vitality. We have developed an absolute phobia of the pause, treating the quiet simplicity of an ordinary moment as an intolerable vacuum of boredom that must be instantly filled with friction, drama, or stimulation, completely unaware that this continuous flight from stillness is systematically eroding our capacity to inhabit our own skin. We observe this same restless exhaustion operating across the entire landscape of our modern communities, noticing how our colleagues, our families, and our friends have similarly configured their lives to attract endless waves of urgency and stress. We listen to them speak of their chronic overwork with a strange hidden pride, wearing their lack of sleep and their elevated cortisol levels like badges of honor that prove their societal worth and existential importance. We have built an entire economic and social architecture that worships the spectacular flash of intense achievement, while thoroughly pathologizing the slow, quiet labor of simple presence, leaving us with a cellular phobia of our own ordinary dimensions. We treat our minds like high-stakes crisis centers, where every minor operational glitch must be translated into an emergency. Every relational misunderstanding must be amplified into a multi-layered drama, and every quiet afternoon must be disrupted by a self-inflicted problem, because we have conditioned our biology to believe that if we are not actively suffering, struggling, or reacting to a storm, we do not truly exist. This collective addiction to emotional and psychological intensity is the exact diagnostic starting point from which our journey together begins tonight, an entry into the unvarnished truth of what it means to slow the human engine down in an age of perpetual acceleration. We are not gathering here to acquire a more sophisticated set of cognitive productivity hacks, nor are we here to design a more intricate set of spiritual concepts to store in the already overcrowded archives of our intellect. Instead, we are here to execute a radical act of biological sabotage against our own conditioning, allowing the frantic currents of our overanalysis to drop to an absolute standstill and beginning the delicate, honest work of tracing this addiction to its physical origin. We must find the rare, unblinking courage to step off the dazzling stage of our performative crises and enter the quiet backstage of our private bodily reality, where the masks of our hyperproductivity are laid aside and the raw, unedited truth of our vulnerability can finally be encountered. It is only by being willing to look directly at the specific cellular architecture of our stimulation reflex that we can begin to discover the coordinates of our genuine liberation, moving past the abstract theories of peace and mindfulness, and instead learning to listen to the immediate, visceral language of our confinement, because the tight muscles of our chest, the frantic vibrations of our eyes, and the hard, humming knot in our stomach are not indications that we are broken. They are the oldest, most reliable guideposts we possess, pointing us back toward a forgotten path of uncalculated stillness that we abandoned long ago in our desperate pursuit of an intense identity. As we allow our bodies to settle more deeply into the stillness of this immediate space, letting the heavy architecture of our bones sink into the unyielding support beneath us, we can begin to bring the focus of our awareness back from the external, digital horizons of our relationships and anchor it firmly within the boundary of our own skin. We can hear the distant, muffled cadence of the city outside, a reminder of the competitive machine that continuously demands our absolute acceleration, but we can choose to let that roar become nothing more than a neutral background canvas for our immediate somatic exploration. We can feel the cool, clean air entering our nostrils and the slightly warmer air leaving our lips, a simple non-intellectual biological reality that requires absolutely no strategy, no adjustment, and no social performance to execute perfectly. In this very moment, we do not have to be productive. We do not have to be hyper-energetic, and we do not have to have our entire life validated by the creation of a crisis. We can simply allow ourselves to be exactly as we are, carrying whatever heavy exhaustions, artificial excitements, or quiet terrors of boredom we have brought with us across the threshold of this hour. Recognizing that the neon lights will continue to flash, the city will continue its frantic dance, and the demands of tomorrow will still be waiting for us. But for now, we are granting ourselves the rare, radical permission to drop the copper wire, step out of the electrical storm, and look directly at the structural cost of standing before the world with a body that has forgotten how to rest upon the earth. To see this hidden penalty of perpetual excitement in its rawest, most undeniable manifestation, we must examine an archetype that operates as a quiet pillar across our modern landscape, the individual who functions as a completely electrified wire, or what we might identify as the chaos magnet. This is the person within the corporate team, the family system, or the social circle who is universally celebrated for being incredibly high energy, boundlessly productive, and entirely available to manage any emergency. From the outside, their character looks like a flawless monument of passionate commitment and endless capability. They are the ones who always step forward to absorb the high-stakes assignments, who gracefully navigate the erratic crises of difficult projects without registering a single complaint, and who balance the chaotic schedules of their professional and personal lives with relentless poise. When a quiet interval appears, they do not rest instead. They immediately look for a new responsibility, a new problem to analyze, or a new milestone to conquer, making sure their internal system encounters absolutely no empty space. They are honored by our culture as paragons of drive and mature competence, yet if we step past the smooth, polished glaze of this energetic presentation, we find a deeply agonizing, private landscape where an independent human life is being systematically melted down under a heavy layer of self-inflicted stress. This profound self-sacrifice is not just an abstract emotional concept. It maps itself with startling precision across the literal musculature and cellular architecture of the physical body. If we carefully scan our internal landscape during those moments when we are actively managing a self-managed emergency or chasing the next digital thrill, we can feel the specific somatic fortifications of the adrenaline-seeking reflex. It begins with a tight, localized contraction within the pharyngeal muscles and the deep root of the tongue, the literal, choking tightness that forms whenever an authentic expression of fatigue is forcibly swallowed down to protect our image of unshakable strength. This muscular compression moves downward into the torso, manifesting as a subtle chronic elevation of the ribcage and a rapid, shallow chest breathing that keeps the sympathetic nervous system perpetually redlined in a survival loop. The facial muscles, particularly the small structures around the eyes and the lower jaw, are held in a chronic, restless tension, or eyes darting from object to object, screen to screen, without resting anywhere, while our teeth remain subtly clenched, hiding an immense somatic weariness beneath a costume of radiant availability. The most critical site of this stimulation addiction resides in the deep center of the torso, within the soft networks of the solar plexus, humming continuously like a high-voltage electrical transformer. In this visceral core, where our natural peace and intuitive stability are meant to generate a solid sense of self, we experience a heavy, hard and vibrating knot of raw anxiety. Because we have spent decades systematically starving our own quiet rhythms to avoid encountering the unsettling texture of stillness, the pathways between our intuitive body and our conscious action have become entirely calcified. When a natural pause occurs or a project ends, the biological system attempts to flash a warning light, an icy drop in core body temperature, a sudden wave of immense exhaustion, or a subtle trembling in the limbs. But our hypervigilant neural pathways instantly intercept these primal distress signals, labeling them as dangerous threats to our survival and identity. We override our biology with a wave of cognitive control, forcing our eyes to seek another distraction, our fingers to scroll another feed, and our schedule to absorb another conflict, leaving our primitive nervous system trapped in a state of continuous, destructive fight or flight, while our outward presentation remains completely dynamic, productive, and useful for everyone else in the room. To comprehend the exact energetic collapse of this hyperstimulated state, we must look into the core metaphor of our exploration, the continuous lightning rod. Imagine a stark, heavy metallic rod driven deep into the ancient bedrock of a barren, storm-swept hill. The rod does not possess its own internal light, its own independent warmth, or its own sustainable source of fuel instead. It survives entirely by positioning itself to attract the violent electrical discharges of passing storms. When a black tempest rolls through the valley, the metal structure draws the blinding lightning bolts down through its iron spine, lighting up the darkness for a split second with a terrifying, spectacular flash. In that moment of high-voltage impact, when the current is rushing through its copper wiring and making the surrounding air hiss with heat, the rod feels entirely alive, powerful, and essential to the landscape. It mistakes the destructive, short-circuiting electricity that is systematically melting its core for true, authentic power, believing that its existence is only valid when it is actively channeling the violent energy of a crisis. This is the hidden catastrophe of the chronic stimulation reflex. The lightning rod never stops burning itself alive. The more we accommodate the frantic demands of our environment and manufacture our own internal storms, the more our independent identity dissolves. Eventually, the metal structure can no longer tolerate the structural stress, its internal wires degrade, its foundation cracks, and it undergoes a profound existential collapse, completely hollowed out by the very current it chased to feel important. We look at our lives and realize that we have become completely dependent on external friction to feel a sense of vitality, possessing no quiet baseline of our own, because we have spent our entire life force adapting to the chaotic velocity of the world. We have purchased an artificial, fleeting sense of importance at the expense of our own biological peace, leaving our mind split between a desperate outward presentation of endless energy and a dark, unspoken underworld of profound existential depletion. When the psychological pressure of maintaining this electrified, hyper-alert identity becomes completely unsustainable, the mind does not simply sit quietly in its dissolution, it manufactures a sophisticated, internal counterattack to justify its own acceleration. To dismantle why this addiction to intensity feels like a slow, toxic erosion of our internal authority, we must introduce a diagnostic tool that the historical awakening tradition utilizes with surgical brilliance. Within the ancient texts, there exists an analytical framework commonly referred to as the law of the two arrows. Imagine you are walking through an open, sunlit valley, and out of the blue, a stray arrow flies through the air and strikes you directly in the forearm. The initial impact is sharp, sudden, and brings an immediate wave of intense physical pain. This first arrow represents the baseline reality of an unvarnished world, the simple fact that in an impermanent universe, life will naturally contain quiet spaces, slow interlopes, and moments where nothing is happening. It is the reality that a project will end, a relationship will settle into a peaceful, non-dramatic rhythm, or an afternoon will offer absolutely no incoming data. The first arrow is an ordinary, non-negotiable property of being a real human being living within a changing universe. It is a biological fact. But then, as we stand in the valley holding our injured arm, a highly unusual and destructive second event occurs. We do not look for a bandage, we do not tend to our skin. Instead, we look at the quiet landscape around us. We look at the silence in our room, and we become filled with a cold, blinding self-fury and panic. We reach into our own quiver, pull out a sharp, jagged second arrow that we have carved out of our own restlessness, place it against the string of our bow, point it directly at our own chest, and release it with full force. This second arrow is our intellectual reaction to our own temporary stillness. The first arrow caused ordinary quietude. The second arrow creates intense, chronic existential suffering. The second arrow is the voice of the internal judge that translates a simple, healthy pause into a devastating verdict of failure and absolute boredom, whispering into the quiet spaces of our mind that if we are not constantly working, fighting, or reacting to a crisis, we are falling behind, that our importance is evaporating, and that if we ever allow ourselves to sit in silence, we will be permanently cast out into the dark of meaninglessness. For those of us caught within the architecture of the continuous lightning rod, our daily lives are an unceasing, self-inflicted barrage of these second arrows. When the first arrow of ordinary quietness hits us after weeks of frantic labor, we do not allow our bodies to lie down on the earth and rest. We immediately release the second arrow of self-castigation, telling ourselves that our peace is a proof of laziness, an act of stagnation, or a betrayal of our potential. When the first arrow of simple presence arises in our chest because an afternoon has cleared, we do not let that silence ground us. We instantly turn the second arrow inward, judging the lack of stimulation as an intolerable vacuum that must be crushed beneath a layer of self-manufactured drama. This internal warfare is far more toxic than the external demands of our environment. It keeps our biological baseline flooded with a slow, continuous drip of stress hormones, ensuring that our sovereign voice remains completely paralyzed beneath a mountain of cognitive condemnation. The constant barrage of these second arrows does not merely create an isolated cloud of temporary stress. It constructs an entirely artificial reality within our consciousness, completely cutting us off from the vital currents of the living world. When we allow our minds to be perpetually hijacked by this frantic cycle of self-inflicted emergencies, we are operating under the supreme arrogance of the modern ego, which foolishly believes it must act as the absolute manager, controller, and architect of all cosmic conditions. We treat our local lives as high-stakes personal enterprises that must constantly display an unblemished profile of high-voltage output and continuous expansion, transforming our careers, our personal projects, and even our relationships into fields of severe existential evaluation. If a single element deviates from our hyper-optimized blueprint, if a creative project encounters a slow interlude, if a market trend shifts unpredictably, or if an afternoon offers absolutely nothing but the quiet ticking of a clock, the ego perceives this ordinary fluctuation as a lethal assault upon its identity. It panics, pulls the emergency brake on our nervous system, and immediately launches a massive counterattack of self-generated drama simply to keep the copper wires of its importance buzzing with chemical intensity. To truly understand why this addiction to emotional and psychological intensity feels like a slow, toxic erosion of our internal authority, we must allow the sharp blade of the historical awakening tradition to cut cleanly through our beautiful deceptions. When we step behind the polished glaze of our frantic productivity and look at our lives through the unblinking eye of absolute presence, we discover that what we proudly call passion, drive, and high-stakes dedication is often nothing more than a highly sophisticated, hyper-vigilant defense strategy designed by the ego to avoid facing the profound illusion of its own fixed permanence. We have been conditioned by a hyper-accelerated society to believe that our identity is a solid, static monument that must be continuously reinforced by magnificent achievements and spectacular emotional displays. We treat our minds like high-powered corporate boardrooms where every passing thought must be translated into an urgent deadline, and every relational misunderstanding must be amplified into a major crisis, completely blind to the reality that this relentless gatekeeping is a desperate attempt to protect a fragile, insecure self-image that is fundamentally terrified of its own emptiness. The ancient wisdom reminds us that when we look into the quiet laboratory of our own immediate flesh, we will never find a permanent, unchanging and independent entity called the self residing within our bones. What we call our identity is not a static rock. It is a dynamic, ever-shifting river of transient phenomenon, unceasing flow of passing thoughts, temporary sensations, fluctuating moods, and changing mental states that arise due to specific conditions and dissolve back into the emptiness from which they came. To expect your mind-body system to remain permanently high voltage, effortlessly creative, and continuously engaged in a state of high intensity without a single pause is as absurd as looking out at a wide mountain river and demanding that it exist entirely as a breaking, foaming wave without a single quiet pool, a single slow bend, or a single calm deposit. The turbulence of the breaking wave is not a moral triumph of the water. It is simply how the river naturally negotiates the uneven topography of the earth. Yet, when the natural quietness of a slow interlude manifests on our loom, we do not view it as natural weather. We immediately convert it into an existential threat, running after the blinding lightning flash, because we are too terrified to sit in the quiet darkness of our own baseline reality. This relentless flight from our own spaciousness creates an acute form of internal fragmentation, dividing our consciousness into a desperate performer that must always chase the next hit of adrenaline, and a deeply suppressed, exhausted human being that is quietly starving for rest. We become completely dependent on external friction to feel a sense of vitality, possessing no quiet baseline of our own, because we have spent our entire life force adapting to the chaotic velocity of the world. We look at our daily schedules, our unread notifications, and our endless lists of self-imposed demands, and we realize that we have turned our highest intellectual and creative gifts into our most merciless tormentors. We have allowed our sophisticated intellect to manufacture a cage of absolute standards that completely starves our biological need for movement, leaving us hollowed out, deeply cynical, and utterly paralyzed on the threshold of our own existence. We are effectively locked in a state of continuous internal civil war, where our vital life force is constantly trying to ground itself in the quiet truth of the earth, while our terrified intellect is applying a massive, crushing brake, keeping our physical biology redlined in a state of exhaustion while our actual historical existence remains completely stuck in place. The historical awakening tradition shatters this exhausting theater of stimulation by introducing the radical, liberating perspective of universal interdependence and the inherent non-existence of a separate self. When we dismantle the fiction of the fixed, monumental identity, we realize that our creative paralysis and our chronic anxiety are actually intelligent rebellions of our biology against the unnatural tyranny of our perfectionism. The body pulls the master circuit breaker to force our frantic intellect to stop its destructive striving before our vital structures are eroded completely. True peace is not a dead absence of feeling, a sterile vacuum of boredom, or a state of permanent numbness. It is the wide, luminous and open ground within which all feelings, all crises, and all lightning flashes pass. True vitality is found in the quiet depth of the ocean, which remains completely unshakable, silent and solid, even while the surface is disrupted by the chaotic foam of a passing storm. The moment we stop firing the second arrows of panic and guilt, the moment we find courage to sit quietly within the texture of our own restlessness, the copper wires of our conditioning begin to cool, and we create the necessary internal space to ground the frantic conductor into the unyielding magnificence, stability of the steady earth. This shift from frantic reactivity to spacious presence requires that we completely transform our relationship with our own physiological discomfort. learning to hold our internal weather with a profound, unconditional softness. When the old voice of the internal judge returns to whisper that our silence means failure, when the frantic urge to check a device or create a relational problem arises in our chest, we do not try to suppress the impulse or punish ourselves for having it. We simply observe its arrival with a vast, open awareness, noting to ourselves with a gentle, compassionate smile that the addiction to intensity has returned to visit our space. We listen to its frantic warnings without purchasing its conclusions, allowing the thoughts to vibrate and dissolve within the boundless sky of our awareness. We recognize that the sky does not collapse when a summer thunderstorm rolls through the valley. It simply stays wide, spacious, and completely unyielding, allowing the rain to fall, the clouds to gather, and the lightning to strike without ever altering its own boundless nature. By resting in this vast, non-reactive space, we break the iron grip of our conditioning, stepping out of the electrical storm of our thoughts and preparing our biology to drop its heavy weight down into the deep, restorative currents of material transformation. To navigate our way out of this self-destructive loop of constant overstimulation, we must understand that the journey toward inner stability is not achieved by launching an aggressive, top-down war against our own overactive thoughts. For generations, we have been conditioned to believe that changing our life means enforcing a strict, militaristic discipline over our mind, demanding that our brain instantly shut off its worry, commanding our pulse to slow down, and using sheer willpower to drag our attention back to a sterile, forced calm. But within the quiet, direct framework of somatic mindfulness, we recognize that this aggressive approach is simply the internal inquisitor changing its wardrobe, adopting a trendy new persona of spiritual control, while utilizing the exact same violence of absolute expectations that built our hyper-accelerated prison in the first place. We cannot use a frantic, controlling current to cure an addiction to intensity. True transformation requires that we completely alter the foundational relationship we have with our own physiological distress, moving away from cognitive manipulation and dropping our center of gravity all the way down into the heavy, slow, and unhurried mechanics of our immediate physical container. We must learn to ground the copper wires of our nervous system directly into the moist, dark bedrock of the steady earth, turning our awareness away from the blinding sky of our conceptual dramas and anchoring it firmly within the boundary of our own skin. This practice of visceral grounding begins the very moment the familiar, urgent impulse to accelerate, to distract, or to manufacture a mental crisis arises within the landscape of our daily routine. When we find ourselves sitting before our digital screens with our fingers hovering restlessly over a device, when we feel a sudden spike of irrational panic because a project has ended and an afternoon has cleared, or when we notice our mind frantically rewriting a minor relational misunderstanding into an existential emergency, we do not engage with the intellectual content of the storm. We do not try to reason with our anxiety. We do not write out pros and cons lists to soothe our fear of falling behind, and we do not chase a fresh wave of information to numb the rising tide of restlessness. Instead, we perform a radical, immediate act of biological redirection. We take our entire conscious awareness completely away from the external horizon of our thoughts, and we drop it straight into the burning, immediate topography of our physical flesh. We sit completely still within our seat and identify the exact coordinate where the stimulation reflex has anchored its high-voltage cables. We direct the steady, gentle light of our attention toward the chronic tightness choking the root of our throat, the frantic, rapid micro-vibrations shaking our calves and thighs, or the hard, humming knot of raw electricity vibrating within our solar plexus. We hold our awareness within these intense bodily regions with the clinical curiosity of an objective scientist, and the unconditional softness of a companion, mapping their precise sensory textures without attempting to change them, fix them, or push them away. By simply choosing to stay present with the raw discomfort of our stillness rather than running from it, we pierce the automatic loop of our conditioning, transforming an instinct of frantic flight into a moment of clear, somatic authority. As we hold our attention steady within the core density of these physical contractions, we can begin to employ a highly precise, biological lever to actively signal evolutionary safety to our overstimulated nervous system, initiating the deep grounding of our electrified structures. We take a soft, deep breath in through the nostrils, imagining the air traveling completely past the restricted, elevated chambers of the upper chest and dropping all the way down into the dark, wide bowl of the pelvis, allowing the lower back, the flanks, and the abdomen to expand outward like a smooth, heavy canvas. Then, instead of holding that air tightly in a defensive grip or releasing it in a sharp, explosive puff, we allow the breath to flow out through slightly parted lips in a long, continuous, and completely silent exhalation, ensuring that the departure of the air lasts twice as long as its arrival. As the lungs thoroughly empty themselves of pressure, we consciously invite our skeletal frame to align itself with the natural vertical axis of gravity. We do not stiffen our body into a hostile, aggressive stance. Rather, we let the vertebrae of the spine lengthen upward with a calm, quiet dignity, while simultaneously letting the heavy muscles of the shoulders slide down away from our ears and allowing the lower jaw to hang loose, breaking the chronic, unconscious clenching of our teeth. This deliberate elongation of the exhalation acts as a profound chemical messenger traveling down the superhighway of the vagus nerve, immediately overriding the primitive survival centers of the brain and demonstrating to our biology that despite the catastrophic predictions of our intellect, we are actually sitting in a space of absolute safety, where the system is granted total permission to stand down from the red line of crisis. Through this sustained somatic anchoring, we create the necessary internal conditions for the master transformation of our awareness to realize itself within the tissue. We allow the high-voltage lightning rod of our identity to root its base deep into the moist, fertile earth, discharging its accumulated static electricity into the boundless space of the present moment. For the individual who has survived by existing as an electrified wire, the transition to absolute simplicity is often viewed as a form of existential death, an intolerable dive into a grey vacuum of boredom where their value and vitality will evaporate completely. But within the quiet sanctuary of deep quieting, we discover that grounding the conductor is not a descent into numbness or a loss of power. It is the reclamation of our true, unshakable nature. A grounded mind is like a massive tree whose roots extend deep into the subterranean bedrock. When a violent storm rolls through the valley, the high-flying branches may sway and catch the wind, but the central trunk remains perfectly unmoved, stable and solid, because its weight is supported by the immensity of the earth. We realize that we no longer need to burn ourselves alive or channel a destructive crisis just to prove that we exist. Our vitality is an intrinsic truth of our consciousness, a steady, self-contained luminescence that remains perfectly complete, whether the sky above us is flashing with lightning or resting in the velvet silence of the midnight stars. Supported by this unshakable internal baseline, we must introduce into the daily patterns of our modern existence the radical, mindful discipline of ordinary simplicity, learning to fully inhabit the quiet intervals of our life without needing to accelerate, optimize, or spice up the experience. For those of us who have lived by the strict laws of defensive optimization, this means training our awareness to celebrate the small, non-dramatic rhythms of reality as supreme acts of meditation. When we walk across a room, we bring our entire attention down to the heavy, textured sensation of our bare feet making contact with the floor. When we drink a glass of water, we feel the cool liquid sliding down the throat without checking a device or listening to a podcast. At the same time, when we sit in traffic or wait for an elevator, we refuse to reach for our smartphones to escape the pause, choosing instead to rest our eyes on a neutral object and feel the gentle rise and fall of our own ribcage. We deliberately step into the spaces between our major life events and allow them to remain wide open and beautifully empty. When the old voice of the internal judge returns to whisper that this silence means we are failing, that we are wasting our potential, or that we are falling behind our peers, we do not argue with the thought. We simply let the words vibrate across the sky of our mind like distant heat lightning, while we keep our physical body anchored to the chair, our breath long and slow, refusing to purchase the delusion that our worth is a chemical dividend of chronic stress. This fierce retraining of our attention must be integrated with a vast, spacious awareness that welcomes our rising tides of boredom, restlessness, and anxiety as ordinary, temporary patterns within the infinite ecosystem of life. For decades, our conditioning has taught us to treat our boredom as an emergency that must be instantly eliminated by a fresh hit of stimulation, creating a hyper-reactive neural network that is always running away from its own baseline reality. But as we rest upon the steady earth of our presence, we learn to sit comfortably within the crackling static of our own discomfort. When a wave of restlessness swells in our chest, we do not try to suppress it or punish ourselves for feeling impatient. We wrap the sensation in the soft, spacious fabric of our breath, allowing it to peak, fade, and dissolve back into the silence from which it arose. We discover that beneath the chaotic foam of our passing impulses lies a deep, luminous ocean of non-reactive presence and internal refuge that remains absolutely untouched by the weather of our thoughts. We stop existing as a lightning rod that must channel every passing storm, and we emerge as a steady, spacious vessel that can hold both the flash of a crisis and the absolute quietude of the night, fully rooted in the deep ground of our own being and completely incapable of burning ourselves alive to satisfy the insatiable demands of a hyper-accelerated world. The cold city rain outside has finally ceased, leaving the glass towers reflecting the faint, pale violet of an early morning sky. The mechanical keyboards remain still. The ambient hum of the modern world has softened into a gentle, distant whisper, and the unblemished documents on our devices wait for us with an open, non-judgmental invitation. The internal inquisitor has surrendered its weapons. The second arrows have been broken against the shield of our compassion, and the unstarted dream has returned home to its natural, undivided unity with the present moment. We are left here in the pristine silence of the dawn, breathing a breath that requires absolutely zero effort to maintain, completely awake to the raw, unedited and magnificent reality of being alive and in motion. The world will inevitably return with the rising sun, demanding that we step back into the theater of perpetual planning and prove our worth through the violence of absolute perfection. But as we sit here, fully anchored in the boundless sanctuary of our own skin, knowing that our wholeness was never dependent on the flawlessness of the output, a deep and revolutionary question remains to reverberate through the quiet corridors of our remaining days. If you no longer need to protect your reputation by remaining abstract and unblemished, what beautiful, textured, and deeply human thread will you dare to weave into the living fabric of the world today?